Now in this part, we're going to talk about the spinal cord. So let's introduce what it is and where is it. These are the continuation of the medulla oblongata. It'll exit the skull through the foramen magnum, which is the biggest opening that is found on the base of the skull. The fibers will continue down the vertebral canal and end at the level of L1, L2, which is the space between the first and the second lumbar vertebrae. It does not continue down into the sacral and into the coccygeal area. What you have in that area is no longer considered the spinal cord. These are nerves. And you can see here that it has two enlargements, so two thickened areas. One of them is the cervical enlargement, and that would be in order to accommodate all of the cell bodies for the nerves going into the upper limb, while the lumbar enlargement is for the cell bodies of the nerves supplying the lower limb. It tapers down at the end in this funnel-shaped area known as the conus medullaris. We divide the spinal cord into segments. So just like we had for the vertebrae, for the bones, we had a cervical area, thoracic, sacral, and lumbar. Well, that's pretty much the same thing for these segments of the spinal cord. We have cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal. Each segment is going to give rise to a pair of spinal nerves, so one on the right and one on the left. And because we have 31 segments of the spinal cord, that means we are going to have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Now you can see here the different parts of the spinal cord. This is actually a real picture of it where it terminates at the level of L1, L2, and you can see how this area looks like a funnel known as the conus medullaris, and surrounded by all of these nerves. Those nerves have been pushed to the side because when they're put together they look like a horsetail. They are called the cauda equina. Now that conus medullaris is attached to the coccygeal bone, so you can see here that little white thread attaches to the tip of the coccygeal bone, and that is known as the terminal filament or the filum terminale. You can see it here again. And that keeps the spinal cord in position. So as we're moving, the spinal cord isn't kind of like bumping or just moving freely within the vertebral canal. Okay. Now you can see a cross section of the spinal cord. So we'll talk about the different parts that we are able to see. This right here is posterior, and this is anterior. There is a groove separating the right and the left side, and posteriorly it is smaller, or the groove is not very deep, and we call it the posterior median sulcus, while the anterior groove is much deeper, and that is known, or wider, and it's known as the anterior median fissure. There are fibers in the middle that connect the right and left side of the spinal cord, and we'll get to that in a minute. Now, all of that white matter on the outside of that butterfly looking gray matter, that white matter is our myelinated fibers. So these are going to be ascending or descending fibers. We call them in the spinal cord, we call them ascending or descending tracts. The ascending tracts are sensory and the descending tracts are motor. The white matter is divided into these three what are known as funiculi. One of them is a funiculus, so this is the posterior funiculus, this is the lateral funiculus, and that's the anterior funiculus. While the butterfly gray-shaped area, or the gray matter, are known as horns, so there's a posterior, lateral, and anterior horn. You can see here again in the middle where these gray fibers communicate the right to the left side, and that is known as the gray commissure. In the middle of the gray commissure, there is a central canal, or a spinal canal, where the CSF fluid is circulating. Remember, we said that each segment is going to give out a spinal nerve, and that's why I have this right here in order to explain how a spinal nerve is made. Each spinal nerve has two roots. It has a sensory root and a motor root. The root that comes in order to orient yourself, this is posterior because this has the spine of the spinous process, and this is anterior because it has the body of the vertebra. So looking at the spinal cord, this would be posterior and this is anterior, or in other words, ventral and dorsal. Here you can see these two roots, these two yellow ones. This one is your dorsal root and that is your ventral root. Your dorsal root is sensory and the ventral root is motor. Here again, you can see them on the other side, dorsal, sensory root, and ventral motor root. To remember which root is which, to kind of think of a car. So cars have the motor in the front, well, unless you have an antique car, but other than that, I mean, normally the motor is in the front, so that's how these roots are arranged. Again, your anterior or ventral root is motor, dorsal or posterior root is sensory. And then you have a dorsal root ganglia, and that again is a collection of all of the cell bodies. Those two roots unite to make a very, very short spinal nerve, and then the spinal nerve divides into two branches or two rami, a posterior ramus and an anterior ramus. Okay, again, we have 31 pairs of these, so 31 on the right and 31 on the left. Now, what are the functions of your spinal cord? Well, it is a center for spinal reflexes. So there are reflexes where the information doesn't really have to go all the way to the brain, but the spine can take care of it, especially if it's protective, like pain reflexes and so on. It is also a pathway for impulses to and from the brain, so a conduit or pathway, which means the ascending and descending tracts are going to pass through the spinal cord in either reach the brain if they're sensory or go away from the brain if they are motor. Let's take a look at the reflex arc. So we said that the spinal cord helps in reflexes. So what is a reflex? A reflex are automatic subconscious responses to stimuli. Okay, those stimuli can either be inside of the body or coming from the outside of the body. And a reflex arc is mainly made out of these parts. So you have a receptor that receives the stimulus, then you have a sensory or afferent neuron that will take that stimulus to the CNS, and then the CNS will send out a motor or an afferent neuron to the effector, which is a muscle or a gland. Okay, sometimes within the CNS there will be an inner neuron connecting sensory to motor, while other times the sensory would be directly connected to the motor neuron. Okay, so if there is no inner neuron, that's known as a simple reflex, but the most common kinds of reflexes that we have are more complicated, where we do have some inner neurons in the middle. So here you can see that sensory reflex, or the spinal reflex, where we're looking right here at the receptor that is found at these are free nerve endings, so these are pain receptors found on a piece of skin. So let's say this person got pricked by a needle. So the receptor will receive that pain stimulus. It'll go through the sensory neuron through the dorsal root, and then reach here. It'll synapse with an inner neuron. Then the inner neuron will synapse with a motor neuron, all the way down to the effector, which in this case is a skeletal muscle. But remember, your effector could either be smooth or cardiac muscle, or it could actually be a gland. So in this example, that skeletal muscle will contract in order to move the way to withdraw the hand away from the painful stimulus. These again are the parts of your reflex arc. We already talked about them, but you could go ahead and take a look at them in this slide. So there's a receptor, a sensory neuron, inner neuron. Like I said, sometimes they're there, sometimes they're not. Motor neuron, and the effector. The part of the reflex arc that is entirely within their CNS is the inner neuron. This is a monosynaptic reflex, or a stretch reflex, and monosynaptic means that there is no inner neuron, so it's just sensory connecting directly to the motor. So a monosynaptic, or the stretch reflex, consists of two neurons, sensory and motor. Okay, and they both of them synapse in the spinal cord. And because there's just one synapse, it is known as the monosynaptic reflex. An example of it is the stretch reflex, also known as the knee jerk reflex. And that is the reflex that I'm pretty sure all of us had done before, where you get tapped on the knee, okay, over on the patella. That stretches stimulates the stretch receptors that are in that patellar ligament. It stretches also the stretch receptors that are found in the quadriceps muscle. That stretch stimulus reaches through the sensory neuron, will reach the spinal cord, and then it'll synapse directly with that motor neuron that'll send an impulse to the quadriceps muscle to contract. Okay, so that is your knee jerk reflex. Again, a monosynaptic reflex. And why do we have that reflex though? We use it to evaluate patients, but we have it in order, it maintains the upright posture of us. It helps us walk. So as you're walking and always stretching the quadriceps muscle and that patellar ligament, you're always stimulating that stretch reflex to occur in order to keep on contracting your quadriceps and be able to walk. Now, a withdrawal reflex, that's a little bit more complicated. So here we do have interneurons. And this reflex, you want to imagine a scenario where somebody's walking and they do step on a tack. So that painful stimulus reaches the spinal cord. Okay, we do have some interneurons, so you can see a couple of interneurons there. And then the motor impulse will go to the muscles and contract the muscles so that the person withdraws their foot, okay? That is why it is called a withdrawal reflex. But, a couple of things to keep in mind, that this is a polysynaptic reflex because it does involve interneurons, so it's more than one synapse. And it involves another reflex that happens on the opposite side of the body. So as this person, this looks like the right foot to me. So as this person is withdrawing the right foot, they would have to extend the left foot so they don't fall. So there is what is known as this crossed extensor reflex. So here you can see the whole reflex, both of them occurring together, where again, that person is about to step on a tack, sensory information into the spinal cord through the sensory or afferent neuron, and then a whole bunch of interneurons. And you want to take a look, focus on the motor neurons. So the motor neuron, one of them is withdrawing the ipsilateral leg. Ipsilateral means the leg on the same side of the stimulus, while it is extending the contralateral leg. Contralateral means the leg on the opposite side. Okay, so that is known as your crossed extensor reflex. And these two reflexes, whether the withdrawal reflex or the crossed extensor reflex, these tend to happen together. Okay, and that is why we need these interneurons, because we have to send motor stimuli to more than just one effector. Here we are sending motor stimuli to effectors on the right and other effectors on the left side. Okay, so some effectors on the ipsilateral, that would be your withdrawal side, while the contralateral side, you are going to need to extend the opposite foot in order to maintain balance and not fall down. So how do we use these reflexes? Well, we use them to assess the condition of the nervous system. We use it as part of a neurological exam. We use it to evaluate the extent of damage. So if somebody has maybe a spinal nerve injury or a stroke, we can use it to evaluate where the damage is, so the location of damage or the extent of it, how bad is it. We can also follow up. So are these reflexes improving or are they worsening? We also use it to test the effectiveness of anesthesia during surgery. So we could always test the patient's reflexes while they're asleep. Examples of reflexes, we have the knee jerk reflex. We talked about that. The plantar reflex, and that reflex is performed on the sole of the feet. At the elbow, we could do the biceps and triceps reflex. We have the abdominal and the cremasteric. So the abdominal reflex is where you would scratch the skin of the abdomen, and that leads to the contraction of the abdominal wall muscles. The cremasteric reflex, that is in males, where we would scratch the skin of the scrotum, and that would lead to the contraction of a muscle known as the cremasteric muscle, and that pulls up the testes into the abdominal cavity, or into the pelvic cavity, I should say. Now for the tracts of the spinal cord, some of them, as we said, are ascending. Those are your sensory ones, and those are in pink in this image. And we also have descending tracts, and those are motor ones, and those are the like the light brown ones in that image. Okay, these tracts are made out of the axons of the neurons, so they are not the cell bodies or the dendrites, but they are the axons. So these are the major ascending tracts that we want to know: the fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cunatus. These are sensory. They are going to carry pain and temperature and proprioception from the upper and lower limbs. Okay, gracilis is from the lower limbs, cunatus is from the upper limb. I tend to remember it, gracilis comes from grace, or gracefully dancing with your lower limbs, while cunatus would be the other one for the upper limbs. The spinothalamic tract, and the good thing about these tracts, at least most of them, is that you can tell where they're going by their name. So spinothalamic would be going from the spine to the thalamus, which means that it is ascending, and which also means, since it's going to the thalamus, it has to be carrying sensory information. Remember, thalamus is your gateway for senses, except for smell. So it can carry sensory fibers that have touch, pressure, pain, and temperature from different parts of the body to the thalamus. Now the spinocerebellar, that conducts sensory info from the spine to the cerebellum, and the cerebellum, remember, was responsible for your coordination of muscle movement. So it will get sensory information related to its function from the lower limbs and from the trunk. Now the descending tracts, those are motor tracts. The first one is known as the corticospinal, and again, the name tells you, where it starts and where it ends. So corticospinal means it's coming from the cerebral cortex downwards towards the spine, and those are for voluntary muscles, or voluntary contraction of the skeletal muscles. So it'll be coming from your frontal cortex. The reticulospinal tracts, those are from the reticular fibers or reticular formation, and that carries motor fibers associated with maintaining muscle tone and the activity of sweat glands. So as you wake up, remember your reticular formation that tends to wake you up. As you wake up, you want to have a muscle tone, so you're going to send some signals to your muscles in order to maintain your muscle tone, and it's also going to start activating the sweat glands. Rubrospinal tract, that's from the red nucleus all the way down to the spine, and that is also associated with muscular coordination of muscle movement. These are all the tracts, where they are, and their functions. You want to focus on the names and functions, and you can use the table, you can use the slides. It's really up to you folks. Now we'll talk a little bit about the clinical application of learning about the spinal cord, and that would be spinal cord injuries. Unfortunately, it's a common injury that happens either in the workplace or in car accidents. The severity really depends on where the damage happened and how much damage occurred. One of the common things would be the compression of the spinal nerves. And because, again, it has a sensory component and a motor component, well, that leads to sensory and motor symptoms. So sensory symptoms, for example, the patient could feel the pain, they could feel numbness or tingling in the part that was supplied by that spinal nerve. Also, it could feel muscle weakness all the way to muscle paralysis. That would be due to the damage of the motor part of the spinal nerve. Okay, that can also lead to muscle atrophy. So not using the muscle will shrink the muscle will become atrophic. Unfortunately, neurons that are found in the peripheries, well, this is fortunately, okay, the nerves that are found in the peripheries can regenerate, but the unfortunate thing is that the neurons that are found in the CNS, like these spinal neurons, these cannot regenerate. Okay, so if there is any injury to an ascending tract, that leads to loss of sensation. An injury to a descending tract can lead to obviously loss in motor function and even paralysis. Research is kind of looking into how, promoting the regeneration of CNS neurons, whether through growth factors or some stem cells, but unfortunately, it is gaining some success, but we're not there yet. So at this part, this ends the spinal cord, and I will see you in the next one.